I'm Rich Gliklich. I'm CEO of OM1. OM1 is a company focused on leveraging real-world data and artificial intelligence in different specialty areas to advance medical research and to personalize healthcare. And it's my pleasure today to be with Ebony Dashiell-Aje, who is my guest and will be speaking about patient outcomes and leveraging real-world data and AI. To start with, Ebony, I would love for you just to tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at BioMarin.
Yeah. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you today. This is a topic that's really close to my heart. I am the head of patient-centered outcome science at BioMarin in clinical development, and the primary research of my function is to lead evidence generation to support the clinical development plan, as well as to support patient centricity throughout the medical product lifecycle. And that involves multiple data sources and incorporating key strategic and methodological processes in order to generate reliable and valid data to measure how patients feel, function, and survive. And before BioMarin, I was actually at FDA, and I also been in consulting. So I have sort of a triad of experience from a measurement perspective to make sure that we're bringing the patient voice and patient experience to bear.
Great. Sounds like you're the triple threat in real-world evidence. So just my first question is really about how are you leveraging real-world data, in particular, clinical data, because that's the era we're in, for the work that you're doing.
Well, I think when we're thinking about evidence generation and evidence generation planning, that's one of the main areas where we're thinking, how can we get the right data to be able to understand how patients are living, with their conditions, and then also how to measure efficacy and safety within the context of any type of, clinical trial as well as observational studies. So when you're thinking about real-world evidence and the real-world data that's generated, we help to contribute to observational study planning as well as endpoint selection. And when I think about sponsors in general, having to integrate multiple sources of data in order to fully understand the patient experience, including the effects of treatment on their daily lives, that's the main core area where we see the value of real-world data.
Great. And on that note, what are the kinds of challenges that you're experiencing as bringing in this kind of multi-source data? Is it finding the right data? Is it the presence or absence of specific endpoints within the data? Is it leveraging or processing kind of the written word and as opposed to structured data? Is it cost? Is it manpower? What are the challenges that you face?
All of them. And I want to speak generally because we all, as sponsors, experience the same issues. So I can tackle a couple of those.
Yeah, great.
So I think first, as you're thinking about what data to generate, you need to understand, well, what are my research objectives? What am I trying to answer? What questions do I need to answer in order to understand the benefit of treatment in a patient's life?
Yeah.
So when you think about that, that ties back to study design. And exactly what type of study is necessary in order to get the data that you need in order to answer those questions. So things that are tied to that in terms of challenges are, well, where in the world do I get the data from? Who's going to actually design the study and generate the data for me? And then once I get the data, how are the different tools to get those data implemented reliably and validly within the context of a study? So all of those three areas pose challenges because with real-world evidence, real-world data generation, there are different rules, within study conduct that allow for more flexibility, which is great. You increase your chances of generating more data, but it's less standardized. There's registries, natural history studies, different standalone observational studies that you can use in order to understand the patient experience, but you can't really force the same strict rules as a clinical trial on those studies, and that by default is how you have to conduct those studies. So because of that, when you're trying to understand how to generate the data, it's really hard to have those multi-stakeholder competing priorities that allow for you to design a study that will holistically gather all the data that you need in a way that you can use it for multiple purposes. So I think that's one of the main challenges. Then there's also competing priorities with clinical trials. So particularly in rare disease drug development, where you have a dearth of patients that you're gathering data from, they're all enrolled in all of these studies.
Yep.
It's impossible.
Right.
When you're thinking about patient centricity and burden. So how do you really get quality data in a real world study where they're not getting any treatment, but there's this clinical trial across the street that it's like, okay, I actually could potentially have my life changed by this treatment. Which one am I going to choose? And the timing and all that kind of stuff. So I think those are huge challenges. And then I want to talk about cost as well. So I sigh because everything costs money, but real world data has to be robust, for it to be really useful.
Yeah.
And so when you're thinking about registries, you're like, okay, I need an N of 120 and 200 and 500. It costs a lot of money to really collect the data in a reliable way. And how do you sort of balance the cost of a clinical trial that you may be having to conduct at the same time as a real world evidence study? And what are the trade-offs? So I think sometimes what ends up happening is that real world study and the observational study is the one where they cut costs the most. So then that perpetuates that cycle of lower quality data or less reliable and systematically collected data. And I think that's what we're trying to figure out. Like, how can you have a robust study without it being regulatory grade per se all the time, and then still get useful information?
Yeah, I'm curious, since you spent time at the FDA, and the FDA has a guidance on leveraging registries for real-world data, and you're working in rare diseases and talking about trying to trade-offs between a registry and a clinical trial. Have you or others in the industry thought more about embedding clinical trials within registries to get maybe the best of both worlds?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that industry is tackling right now. Like, how can you sort of create these robust areas? There's a lot of study designs where folks are using registries as rollovers into their trials. There's trade-offs with that, of course, because you're limiting the amount of observational time you have within the registry, or not registry, or natural history study. I like to call it that. And there's trade-offs to the exact data that you'll get. A lot of folks want to have a value proposition of having some level of observational study, being natural history study, that can be some level of external control, to their clinical trial data. But there are trade-offs there, because again, when you have a patient population that is so desperate, and desperate in a good way, like very eager to have an opportunity to treat life-threatening illnesses or what have you, what's the ethics behind putting them into this observational study and not putting them into a clinical trial? So I think there's constant dialogue with regulators, and they always say, come early and often, and I feel like that is the key, is having that true partnership with regulators. And it's not just FDA, it's EMA, PMDA, it's a global thing where you have to really understand how can you really incorporate the benefits of real world data without sacrificing some of the things around the ethics or the rigor, and then still have that data be useful as supportive complementary evidence for a clinical trial.
And just on that note, I would assume it's also critical that even when you're collecting real world data or observational data, that it meets the requirements, the regulatory requirements, to be of use to you.
Yes. And I think that's where the multi-stakeholder balancing comes in, because real world data back in the day, used to be mainly used for safety, right? Not really thought about in the context of efficacy. And then also most relevant in the post-marketing setting. Now there's value of real world data within the regulatory context. So when you're thinking about the rigor that's required in order to meet those standards, particularly if people want to use it as comparator data, external control data, the bar is pretty high. And it's pretty high in terms of making sure that you are measuring the evidence or generating the evidence in the right patient population that is reflective of who you're going to enroll in your trial on many different levels. And I think that's where the conflict comes, because there's traditional ways of collecting these data and there's traditional ways of analyzing these data, but when you have variability across the data sets, when you can't really link them appropriately, when you don't have the core characteristics of the patient population reflected in that data set. When you think about data that's been collected like way back when, 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, there's a problem even with the tools that were used. So you have to use the same measures, the same biomarkers, the same, and they may have been different. And that's where you get the regulatory challenges with usage, you know?
Right. And so I'm hearing from you at least two problems. So one is standard of care changes. And so you really have to be as contemporaneous as possible. And the second is you can't use every data source because it may not meet the FDA's fit for purpose requirements. And like the two that I think of most are traceability and auditability. Because if you're, a claims data source or a, syndicated electronic medical record system, you can't go knock on that site's door and have an FDA inspector go visit them. So you really have to be planning ahead for these data sources, and that's where it gets expensive.
Yeah, exactly. And I do want to take things, globally, because, EMA has many initiatives as well, partnerships, really focusing on big data and the use of these deep data sets in order to help accelerate drug development. And EMA and FDA partner very closely together on standards. And then, of course, you have the multiple, entities globally that are trying to harmonize standards. But that harmonization piece, I think, is one of the biggest challenges, is how do you harmonize the data when you get it, And I don't know if you want to go to this, but when we think about big data, you know what it brings to mind? Big samples, right? And there's a disadvantage in rare disease drug development because you don't have the robust data sets, you don't have the robust samples to have this aggregation of so many different insights to be able to.
What do you mean by, you dig into that a little bit more, when you say we don't have the robust samples with big data, what do you mean?
Well, I'm just saying, like, the big data, when I'm thinking about big data, it's not the same as, big data sets, but I'm saying the first thing that comes to my mind is how much data do I need, in order to understand in a real world setting what's really happening with patients. And the theme of it all is how much data can I get? How much data do I have in order to know that this is a true occurrence or this is truly the experience? Even when you're thinking about applying these to different technologies and methodologies, simulation and all that stuff, you really need good data, but a good amount of it. A
high percentage of actually the patients with the disease.
And so I think that's something that we have to really think through. How much data is enough, And that's where the regulators come in. How much data is enough? For you to really be confident that this is suitable.
And a question for you on the, Europe, the GDPR. How do you overcome or deal with that in your efforts to at least have parallel processes happening, in both continents? And we'll leave Asia aside for now, but in those two continents.
I can say that that's an ongoing work in progress.
Yep.
And so I just sat on the HMA, EMA Big Data conference. They had one last year, and it was interesting to hear, the current thinking and how there are regional constraints and restrictions, particularly around sharing data, sharing PHI,
Yes.
and I don't think we've yet been able to crack the code on exactly how best to overcome that challenge
Right.
most effectively. But I do feel that from the research perspective, it's important, as I mentioned, to talk with regulators about, well, what data is necessary.
Right.
Because you're not going to be able to get all of it. And you're not
Yep.
going to be able to link all of it. And you're also not going to be able to standardize all of it.
Yeah.
So what is most important?
Yeah.
And that's that dialogue where it's like, okay, how much is enough and what's suitable to be able to say this is now translatable.
Yep. Excellent. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. Like if we're at DIA, and if we look around the room, we probably see the letters AI almost everywhere.
Yeah.
So let's talk about AI. Let's get into the
love
hype
it.
cycle. Okay. So I'm thinking about how might the industry utilize AI technology in patient-centered outcomes research, and both that and also what are the current obstacles. And we'll dig into some obstacles as you start talking about how we might use it.
Yeah, well, I think that AI has a lot of potential, particularly as we're thinking about needing to speed up the process of drug development, quicker to market. Quicker to market means quicker potential access, means that you improve patients' lives faster, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the ultimate goal. So from a patient centricity perspective, AI, I feel, is always something that is a complementary tool that we can think through the potentials for.
Yep.
I feel like the most acceptable area where people are most comfortable right now is with machine learning and being able to collate, understand, learn natural language processing. Like people are comfortable with that because it means that you have a trusted data source you're taking data from, and then you're just creating efficiencies around data summarization and being able to make sense of a bunch of data that a human, it would take a long time to do, right? So I think that is like the lowest hanging
Yeah, let's dig into
advantage.
that a little bit. So leveraging AI to process language, to cull from clinical text and reports, which is 80% of clinical information, standardized data points is I think what you're talking about.
Yes.
And the old methods were not that old, last couple of years ago, were really about abstractors going in and, groups would have 250 abstractors going at it. And now we can leverage various versions of language models.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the FDA regulations on evaluating those models is still a little bit behind where the state of the art is. So, in the work we do, we do a lot of processing of unstructured data to structured data for submissions to the FDA. And as you know, the FDA wants the ability to inspect algorithms.
Yes.
So we have to use a platform that allows inspection of algorithms, while in the more advanced work we use LLMs, which is much harder to allow inspection. How much work are you doing with unstructured data from EMRs and such for your work and bringing that into structured information, or having partners do that so you can use that type of information?
I think that like most sponsors, we're working into that, from a general perspective. I think regulators, they have their standards and they're being more open to it. So that I think that's helping people become more comfortable with adopting at least segments of the methodology and experimenting in smaller scales. I know that there are a number of instances where many different sponsors are trying to incorporate some aspect of this into their methodologies, particularly with clinical development. I would say though that it's still slow going, because I think that there's tremendous value of really extracting data, understanding disease progression, disease trajectories, predictive modeling, and being able to understand like, okay, well, if we do X, then what will the trajectory of this particular type of patient look like over the course of X amount of years? And then what's required in order to change that trajectory, right? So I think there's tremendous value in the earliest stages of clinical development to be able to use that particular methodology and really get a good handle on hypotheses around a specific asset molecule and how that could benefit a patient.
And it is, have you been able to experiment with that type of technology at this point?
Well, I think for us, there's always openness to exploring it, and I think for my perspective, it's valuable to seek out many different offerings, and so I think in terms of our strategy, I can't really speak to exactly what we do, but I think it's important to acknowledge that all of us as sponsors, even in the public-private partnerships and consortia, we are truly exploring which vendors, which types of algorithms, what are acceptable, testing things out, on different publicly shared data sets to play with it, and understand, okay, does this really work? But you use data that's readily and publicly available so everyone can see exactly how this works and gain confidence so then they can apply that to their own internal business.
Yeah, you had said there might be some other areas that you've applied or industry is applying AI, so we stopped on unstructured. Keep going.
Yeah. So other areas applying AI, it is dealing with synthetic trials. I know that's an area. There are a number of different sessions here at DIA that are talking about the value of simulation, synthetic trials. I just sat on a session about digital twins and
we'll talk about that in a second.
The potential use of that in research.
Yeah.
But I think there is opportunity for incorporating simulation and then creating a synthetic trial to really understand how things play out and might play out with your specific treatment. And it's really interesting. They've done a lot of work in SLE and different areas where it has been beneficial to understand exactly what a trajectory could look like and how a drug could impact a patient. But the one thing that I have noticed is that everyone's talking about it within the context of RCTs. People are talking about it within the context of a huge amount of historical data that can be drawn upon. And I think that's one point I want to make, even when I was at EMA, just talking about the need for good data to draw from.
Exactly.
Because AI is a technology. It's not a human, it's not a person, so it has to learn.
Right.
And in order to learn, you have to have good data for it to learn from.
Yep.
And that goes back to the first question you asked about, right? How do you have that good data?
Yep.
And I do feel that it goes back to operations and us really changing the paradigm of clinical operations in order to really create good studies where this data can come from.
Yeah, I love what you said there, because the AI is the technology, but it has to learn on the data. And you need great data and you need validated data to be able to do that. And once you have that, you really can, find tremendous things. One of the comments you made is about work that you've done in SLE, and we do some work in SLE, and just as an aside, what we have found in SLE, and this won't surprise you, is applying AI and looking at trajectories, and we should talk about that a little bit more. We have found many different subtypes of SLE that actually have very different trajectories. So getting to your comment earlier about using AI to look at a disease and a potential therapy early on in drug development, talk a little bit about that, how you would apply that, and then I want to go later on to the patient perspective. So if you start there, and then we'll bring it to the patient.
Yeah, no worries. I think, so the early on piece, as you're in your phase of understanding how to bring a drug or an asset into clinic and understanding your target population, like who are you really trying to treat? Who would benefit most from this type of treatment? And it goes back to concepts of interest, like exactly what aspects of health, meaningful aspects of health, can be changed by a therapeutic. And that gets down to like subpopulations that would benefit most. So the piece around, well, what does this condition look like over time with different subpopulations of a specific, patient community? That's where I think there's value early on, because I feel that that's where the questions lie the most from a clinical perspective. I mean, you're literally experimenting and creating a hypothesis based off of what you know from animal models and different, molecular results, but you don't really understand how it's going to work inside the body of all these different types of patients. So particularly with heterogeneous patient populations, there can be tremendous advantage, I think, of using this as a process of designing studies and really targeting the patients that this could potentially benefit the most. And that comes with learning, though, because a lot of people don't know what the power of this particular methodology could be. And that requires upskilling. It requires people change management and people seeing the value and the investment, return on investment. Like, how much is this going to save me? And then even from there, so just the identification of the patients, understanding the potential disease trajectory, potential impact of a therapeutic on a patient's life, but then recruitment of patients too, so there's a tremendous value in identifying how to enhance trial recruitment, how to understand who, would enroll in a trial, thinking about the benefits of creating space for innovation within the trial design and seeing the outcomes of that innovation and how that could speed up the time, how it could reduce costs, how it could be more patient-centric, reduce the amount of dropouts, like all of that kind of stuff can be used early on in order to enhance a study. And so it's not just from the analytics perspective, from the efficacy and safety data, but just from the overall, data experience, like how will, this trial pan out if we were to do X, Y, or Z?
So I've got 3 questions coming from what you just said. So one is, you work in rare diseases. How valuable is to the industry is the AI capabilities of finding patients for trials or finding patients for therapy?
Very valuable, because I think to the extent that you have publicly available information, or even have private information that is accessible, to understand the catchment areas, to understand the different subpopulations and where they are and how they move even, right? I think AI could really help to summarize exactly who you should be going after and where they are, and then the receptivity. So there's data that can probably be available around the likelihood of certain patient populations enrolling in a study. And I think that AI could potentially help to understand patterns.
And even finding investigators who don't know they have those populations of patients. One of the things that we've seen is sometimes patients will present to certain types of specialists, but when actually you look at the population through an AI lens, you see patients who are undiagnosed presenting to different types of specialists.
Exactly. No, it could be very useful in that way.
One thing you had said, you had gone to a digital twinning session earlier on. Probably haven't had a lot of time to think about this, but one of the ways that that type of technology can be used, and there's a lot of people use that term in different ways, is to take real world data and project a control group from the same patient. So you're doing a phase 2, you're treating a patient, but projecting what would have happened to that patient if they hadn't been treated, and then creating that's truly a synthetic control arm
Yes.
as opposed to an external control arm.
Yes.
Any thoughts about that type of technology?
I think it's worth exploring for sure. There are limitations though to the technology and the predictive modeling that comes with that, and understanding how much of that is true,
Yep.
you know, and how much of it is over biasing as
Yep.
well. So I think that that's one of the main issues, is how do you control for true bias
Yep.
that can occur with these types of analyses.
Totally agree. I have one last question for you. I want to bring it back to the patient. So you've been talking about patient trajectories,
Yes.
and we're all patients at some point. And one of my areas of interest is presenting to patients what their trajectory is likely to be. Do you see an opportunity to give back to patients, to subjects who are participating in your trials, an opportunity to give them back their trajectories so they know what to plan for, what to tell their families?
Wow. You know, that would be phenomenal, you know, I think, to some patients, because we're in an era where, from the patient community, you know, they feel like not enough is given back to them. They don't understand themselves.
Yeah.
And there's no way for them to understand themselves at that deep medical level without sharing information with them. So I do feel that if there is a way to ethically present what, and also have a little bit more certainty that what will be presented is closest to truth,
Yes.
then yes, it could be valuable.
And that's important. It's got to be truthful. It has to be validated. Exactly.
And that's where I'm a little bit worried
Yep.
that we're not there yet, because there was an article that I'm going to read probably tomorrow. It's about AI hallucinations.
Yep,
and,
it happens.
And so I feel like it's too risky right now, because as patients, as a caregiver myself, as a patient myself, you're fragile in moments where you're uncertain about your health.
Yep.
So you don't want something to exacerbate that fragility, to create a level of distrust even, because what happens if it's not so true?
Right.
And there's an aspect of faith and hope that helps as well, and you don't want to take that away by telling someone, hey, this model says surely. I mean, you think about actuaries, for instance.
Yeah.
That's their whole job, is to project like your survival.
Right, right.
You know, and sometimes that can be grim for some people.
It's true.
So you have to be careful, be very careful, not to diminish hope with folks with something like that.
And yet it's a great opportunity.
It is.
I want to thank you for joining me, and I want to thank DIA for hosting this session, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.